It sort of taught me everything about what journalism shouldn't be. It was a media sweatshop churning out half-baked, awful stories.
Welcome to Transparency Talks, the podcast that brings you conversations about truth, transparency, and trust. I'm your host, Winston Mwale, and today we have an exceptional guest joining us, Micah Reddy, Africa Coordinator at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ. Micah brings a wealth of experience from his time as an investigative journalist at the Amabungane Center for Investigative Journalism in South Africa, where he worked for several years, and his previous role as National Coordinator for Media Freedom and Diversity at the Right to Know campaign. Micah has established himself as a leading voice in cross-border investigative journalism across Africa, and his recent groundbreaking investigations have exposed corruption in countries like Equatorial Guinea, examined the impact of World Bank health initiatives, and uncovered how private equity funding has affected African healthcare systems. Micah, welcome to the show. Your journey has taken you from countries like South Africa to Oxford, Yemen, Egypt, and now you are coordinating ICIJ's work across Africa. So first things first, tell us about this remarkable journey and what drew you to investigative journalism.
Thanks, Winston, and thanks for having me on the show. I suppose I've been in journalism and media for about a decade. My father was a media man, so I was exposed to news and journalism from a young age. Every morning, the breakfast table would be full of a spread of the day's newspapers. He would have the BBC blasting on the radio. And so it's kind of the environment I grew up in. I wanted to be a journalist, I think, again, partly because my father sort of encouraged my curiosity. I wanted to see the world and write about it. And so from quite early on, I wanted to do journalism. And then I went to university. I didn't study journalism. I studied history and politics. That gave me a good grounding in journalism. My history supervisor encouraged me to carry on with history, saying it teaches you a lot of the kind of critical skills you need for the sort of journalism I now do. If you look to the UK, for instance, a lot of leading journalists, they didn't study journalism. They studied history and politics and philosophy and so on. So I then went to the UK to study, did a master's in African studies. And when that was completed, I felt I needed to try and break into journalism. And it was not long after the Arab Spring had begun. Well, actually, the Arab Spring was sort of being dismantled around the time I finished my master's. And there was sort of counter-revolution and coups and that sort of thing taking place across the Middle East. At the time, Egypt was very tempting. It was easy to get to. I wanted to learn Arabic, and it was an interesting place to cover at the time. So that was around the ousting of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Sisi regime was in power, and it was all just, horrific in many ways, but also, frankly, kind of exciting from a journalistic point of view. And so I moved to Egypt, tried to get into freelancing, and worked for what I felt was a pretty appalling news organization where I was a copy editor. It sort of taught me everything about what journalism shouldn't be. It was a media sweatshop churning out half-baked, awful stories. And then I got an opportunity to go to Yemen through a friend. I really wanted to visit it. The country had intrigued me. A friend of mine was also trying to get into media. She had learned about an opening in Yemen and she couldn't pursue it. And so she told me about it. This was at the Yemen Times, which is a very interesting little publication. It's pretty much former now. It collapsed after the war began, the latest war in Yemen. But anyway, I got this position as managing editor for the Yemen Times. So I flew off to Yemen and was there. They had a kind of rotation system. They would bring in foreign editors for short stints. It was a dual language organization. So they had an Arabic radio station and an English print publication. And that was very interesting working with local journalists. There were some really gutsy, interesting young journalists working there. It was a paper that was founded by a sort of freedom of expression activist who was killed in mysterious circumstances. It prided itself on being an outspoken voice, taking a progressive stance, being very influential among the intelligentsia and in sort of like policy-making circles among English-speaking readers. It positioned itself as a small independent publication that was telling Yemen's story to the outside world. So that was very interesting. I was there for a while, and then freelanced around the Middle East looking for stories after my term there was up. Then I came back to South Africa thinking I would just come back temporarily, and I ended up staying and working with the Right to Know campaign, focusing on media freedom and diversity. So that was interesting being in the civil society and policy space. From there, because there was some overlap with Amabungane Center for Investigative Journalism, after a relatively short while at the Right to Know, I moved to Amabungane, and that's when I started investigative journalism, which was what I wanted to do, partly because I think in South Africa we're very interested in hard-hitting political stories. If you look at book sales, the books that sell in South Africa are current affairs and politics books, more than fiction. That's not the case in the UK or US. It's the other way around. And we have this long, quite sort of proud tradition of rigorous, bold investigative journalism that really shakes politics. I used to read the Mail and Guardian a lot, and those stories seem to have real impact. And I always thought it was quite impressive what they did. When I got the opportunity to go to Amabungane, it was a dream come true for me. Worked there for a few years, and then we had done some work with ICIJ, where I am now. One of the first stories I worked on at Amabungane was an ICIJ project. I remember flying off to Germany for a big project meeting, and it was all very exciting. We had this massive leak, and it was a great introduction to investigative journalism. When an opening at ICIJ came up, and I felt that I wanted to expand my horizons and move beyond looking at South Africa, I went for it, and it just felt right for me at the time. And here I am at ICIJ, 2 or so years later.
Yes, you have transitioned from working at Amabungane, one of Africa's premier investigative journalism centers, to now coordinating ICIJ's Africa operations. How has this shift from kind of local to international cross-border investigations changed your approach to journalism?
I don't think it has in any fundamental way changed my approach. The experience is different in some ways. But at Amabungane, although it was focused on Southern Africa, it still relied, its ethos was still very much collaborative. And so a lot of the leading projects, by its very nature, right? Investigative journalism out of necessity has to be more and more collaborative because of resource constraints, because newsrooms are being, cut down, and because investigations they're resource and time intensive. And if you think of Amamungane's hardest hitting investigations, there were collaborations, most of them, like the Gupta leaks, for instance. So that was multiple newsrooms. Amabungane also worked on international projects. As I said, one of my first stories at Amabungane was with ICIJ. I think that was Paradise Papers, and Amabungane also sort of positioned itself. It carved out this niche as a kind of center of excellence for the region. The investigative journalism hub, IJ Hub, was spun out of Amabungane. That was a unit devoted to strengthening investigative journalism capacity across the region. We also would have a lot of fellows coming in. In fact, I started out at Amabungane as a journalism fellow. Journalism fellows would come from other news organizations to work with Amabungane. We also syndicated our copy. So when we published stories, they would end up in Business Day, News 24, Daily Maverick, all over the place. So, by its nature, it was collaborative. It just focused pretty much exclusively on South Africa, sometimes Southern Africa. And ICIJ is, of course, global. The transition was quite easy in a sense because I came from this culture of collaborative investigative journalism and moved into one that just had a different focus, a different ambit. So yeah, it kind of all made sense. It was a very logical progression for me. I now work with, I mean, it's I suppose more collaborative in the sense that we work with just a lot more partners. I rarely do a story by myself. There's always so many other people giving inputs and editing stories and so on. But yeah, at ICIJ, I mean, when we work on an investigation, it's often dozens, sometimes even hundreds of journalists involved. I am responsible for organizing partners in Africa. We're pretty well represented across the continent. So there's a lot of collaboration.
I've noted your recent investigation into Equatorial Guinea's Playboy Prince revealed how millions were funneled to a Portuguese construction company while the country burned through its oil riches. Can you briefly walk us through this investigation and the challenges of reporting in a country that, appears to have no press freedom?
Yes, so the short version of the story is that, well, this is about a Portuguese firm, a subsidiary of a construction giant called Andrade Gutierrez, which has a controversial past. The parent company is based in Brazil. It was implicated in the sprawling Lava Jato investigation in Brazil. There was a massive anti-corruption investigation that ensnared a whole lot of very prominent people. In fact, the CEO of Andrade Gutierrez was arrested and sentenced and imprisoned on corruption charges. This subsidiary of Andrade Gutierrez entered the Equatorial Guinean market a long time ago and basically got into business with the son of the president, who is this infamous so-called Playboy Prince. He's been labeled a Playboy Prince in media. And he's the son of the president. He's also the deputy president now of the country. And he's notorious for his flamboyant lifestyle. He's also been roped up in investigations in various jurisdictions. So he's had assets seized in the US, in France. He's been sanctioned in the UK. He's had assets seized in South Africa. And he's been criminally charged in France in this very prominent anti-corruption case known as the Bien Malakwi case. It was a sort of sprawling, years-long investigation and legal process that ultimately resulted in him being charged for fraud and corruption and having all sorts of assets seized. Parts of the case are still ongoing because he's trying to claw back some of his assets. The story focused on the relationship between this Portuguese Brazilian firm and Teodorin, the son of the president. And we found that the company had scored all sorts of very lucrative contracts, construction and infrastructure contracts, centered around a new capital that the country was constructing out of, from nothing, a brand new purpose-built capital in the middle of the rainforest in Equatorial Guinea. And this firm got very lucrative contracts worth millions and millions of euros over several years. And it was paying, at the same time, a company belonging to Teodorin that French prosecutors had identified as just an empty shell for the siphoning of public funds. So, in short, it looked like Zagop, this Portuguese firm, was paying kickbacks to the son of the president and was in return getting lucrative construction contracts. This is the norm for Equatorial Guinea, to do business in the country. I mean, it essentially operates as a family business. The ruling family, the Obiangs, control everything. They've been in power since independence. In fact, the current president is the longest serving head of state in the world. He ousted his uncle, who presided over Equatorial Guinea in a very bloody, brutal dictatorship. The family has an absolute stranglehold over the country and its economy. Any company doing any business of any significance in Equatorial Guinea has to appease the ruling family. And that's what the story was about. It was also about how Equatorial Guinea just squandered its wealth, because it came into significant wealth in the sort of late 90s, 2000s, after oil reserves were discovered there, significant oil reserves. And in fact, it became basically a middle income country on paper. Its GDP per capita was comparable to Spain and some European countries. Yet the country is beset by poverty, rampant poverty. The Obiangs and the ruling elite looted with, absolute abandon. And very little of that wealth trickled down. So there was no sustainable development. Money was squandered on prestige projects like this new capital. And that was really a startling thing about Equatorial Guinea. I mean, you can just see the waste. It is so tangible everywhere you go. There are these massive white elephant projects that have not benefited the population in any way, that were used as, either to boost the regime's prestige, to boost its image and portray this image as a wealthy country to outside investors or whatever, or just as ways of looting, So that was the story in a nutshell. And it was, of course, very difficult to report from there because it is such a closed authoritarian system. There is no press freedom. In fact, we did work with an Equatorial Guinean partner, but he lives in exile in Spain. It is a country that is known for arbitrarily arresting dissidents, critics, perceived critics. It's a highly paranoid regime. And so, the difficulties there are quite obvious. I think we did think it was worth reporting from the ground because the scale of the looting and waste is just, it's frankly astounding. It had to be seen to be believed. We wanted to see it, to describe it. We wanted to meet with people. All of that presented a considerable challenge. We felt it best that I go in. We couldn't send our Equatorial Guinean partner in. He would be arrested on the spot, I imagine. The idea was that I would go in, not hiding the fact that I'm a journalist, but not saying I was there to do journalism. So I was there ostensibly as a tourist. We took safety very seriously. We took, there was a sort of high level of preparedness, high level of risk. And so we took a lot of precautions in preparing for this trip. Worked with a very good digital team. They sort of prepped me in terms of digital safety, clean my devices, that kind of thing, of anything that could be compromising. We had a good set of security protocols in place and tried to, myself and I was with the driver. We were arrested for, it was not entirely clear what for, whether it was theft or trespassing or what, but while we were in this new capital, just wandering around taking photographs, we were stopped by private security who then called the police on us. And they didn't seem that interested in my driver. But I ended up in a police station for a day, which was somewhat worrying because Equatorial Guinea, like I said, it's a paranoid regime. Power is exercised completely arbitrarily. And you never know, things can get unpredictable. The regime has a habit of locking up South Africans. While I was there, 2 South Africans were languishing in the country's notorious prisons. They had been locked up as kind of political bargaining chips because South Africa had confiscated the Obiang Jr., Theodorin's assets in relation to another case where he locked up a South African businessman after a business deal went awry. A business deal, I think, involving his uncle. And that businessman was eventually released. He sued Theodorin in South Africa. The South African state then confiscated his assets, so he locked up these other 2 South Africans. It looked like it was completely, it looked like they were completely innocent. And the charges were just trumped up drug charges. So with that in mind, it was somewhat nerve-wracking, but we had good systems in place. We were prepared for it. And thankfully, it didn't amount to much. I was released later that evening. But that gives you a sense of just how difficult it is to operate there. It's a very, very unpredictable place. People are paranoid. They have every reason to be paranoid because the state is so paranoid and is brutal in the way that it exercises power and control.
Now, Mika, I was wondering, how do you identify which stories warrant international attention versus those that are primarily local concerns? How do you decide?
Well, I think it's part of the beauty of how we operate because we are an international consortium. The stories that we produce, for our own website, the stories that we at ICIJ, as in ICIJ's journalists, write, are invariably stories that cross borders. They are, by their very nature, stories that appeal to a global audience, if you will. But we work with our partners across the world, and they write what they want to write. So we'll work on the same project, pool resources, share information. We'll collaborate in this very meaningfully democratic way, if you will, in the sense that sort of everyone has a say in how the project shapes up and the kind of rules that we set ourselves and protocols and, for instance, around publication times and that kind of thing. So, it's a very kind of inclusive, genuinely collaborative space. And we don't have any editorial control over what our partners write. They write what they write. They're responsible for what they write. And so they are writing for very different audiences. If I look at the stories that I've worked on, the projects I've worked on in Africa, we did a big thing on Eswatini, and there were various stories emanating from a leak from the Eswatini Financial Intelligence Unit. And there were all sorts, those stories went in all sorts of angles. All the stories we wrote had a kind of cross-border element. They were internationally relevant in the sense that they appealed to like an international audience. But our Swazi partners wrote stories that were very much about, well, we actually didn't. That's a bad example because we didn't have sort of journalists in Swaziland writing stories, but we worked with local partners in South Africa. They wrote South Africa-specific stories. We had partners in Zambia. They wrote stories relevant to Zambia. That's how ICIJ works. There's always a local element and an international dimension. We always go for the international dimension, but our partners often write local.
Mm-hmm. For young journalists across Africa who aspire to do cross-border investigative work, what practical advice would you give them about building skills and networks necessary for this type of journalism?
It is difficult because, as everyone in journalism knows, there are increasing resource constraints. There's just fewer and fewer resources to go around. Newsrooms are being cut. That means there are fewer opportunities. Yeah, and with all this belt tightening, it's very hard, I think it's very disheartening for journalists and would-be journalists, but it also is much harder to find opportunities. There are just fewer journalism jobs. There's less funding and less opportunities to develop one's skills. So it's difficult, but opportunities do still exist. Websites like IJNet often publish job openings, workshops, and conferences, and so on. Those are all important. Organizations like Amabungane have fellowships. So there are a lot of, they are harder to find, but they are there. I'm just trying to think of some examples close to home. Amabungane has had a long-standing fellowship program. In fact, I think I'd mentioned earlier that I started out as a fellow. And there are, grant-making organizations do provide a significant amount of funding for freelancers and also journalists, full-time journalists who don't have whose newsrooms don't have the resources. These organizations provide grant money for specific projects. A lot of, for instance, environmental investigative stuff. There's funding for, healthcare journalism, for those sorts of long-term projects that are investigative. Those opportunities do exist. I think, for young journalists starting out, it's hard. It's a pretty intimidating climate, and it's hard to know where to start. So one has to be willing, I think, to just knock on doors. As competitive as the journalism industry can be, I think that journalists, there's quite a strong sense of kind of camaraderie and people are willing to help out. And if you, as someone who's sort of mid-career and has some experience, I often get people coming to me with sort of story ideas or stuff they need help on, people who are trying to kind of break into journalism, or who are journalists, early career journalists trying to develop investigative skills. I try to be as available as possible. And I think, a lot of more experienced journalists are willing to help. And then in terms of, the thing is, you have to start writing and developing story ideas and pitching those. I know it's easier said than done, but really to get into investigative journalism, you have to just start trying to do it. And so young journalists starting out trying to break into investigative journalism should just start looking for those stories, should be, unafraid to approach editors, to approach investigative centers and newsrooms with their stories and story ideas, and just seeing if they can take them anywhere. We often have people coming to us, people coming to me who I've never met before with story ideas. And, very often those stories don't go anywhere. But it's a start, because sometimes they do. And that's your entry into investigative journalism.
All right. So finally, Micah, just like the rest of our guests, if one of our listeners out there would want to find your work, where would they go? Any website, any social media platform?
Yes, ICIJ.org. That's where you'll find everything that ICIJ does and my work as well.
It was a pleasure to speak to you. We don't take your presence for granted. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
All right. That concludes this episode of Transparency Talks. We are deeply grateful to Micah Reddy for joining us today and sharing his insights on cross-border investigative journalism, his powerful investigations across Africa, and of course, his work coordinating ICIJ's vital mission across the continent. And his transition from local advocacy and journalism to international coordination shows the importance of building bridges between different scales of investigative work, ensuring that African stories receive the attention and resources they deserve. If you found this episode valuable, please share it and leave a review. And of course, don't forget to join us next time for more conversations about truth, transparency, and trust. This has been Winston Mwale, your host. Until next time, keep questioning, keep investigating, keep holding power accountable.